Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Bentley Priory Museum's online talk today. It's lovely to have everyone joining us. Our talk today is the next in our series of Cold War talks. And this series has been put together to complement our current project, which is Bentley Priory's Bunker, defending Britain from Nazi and nuclear threat. And this project is being funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund to explore the exciting top secret history of our bunker. So if you'd like to know any more information about that project, or also for access to either our exciting podcast series, which has been put together just recently over the last couple of months with interviews from personnel who worked during the Second World War and the Cold War in the bunker. And also newly up are some recordings of our previous Cold War online talks. That's all available on our website. So if you want to check it out, please do take a look at our website later. So I'm very delighted to welcome today our speaker, Dr. Alastair Noble. Alastair is an historian at RAF Air Historical Branch, and today we're going to be looking at the changes that Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher made to the UK defence policies in the early 1980s and the impact of those changes on the RAF during the Cold War. So Alastair's going to talk to us today for around 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for some questions afterwards. So please do feel free to submit a question at any time during the talk via the Q&A function. The button is just at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best at the end of the talk to answer as many of those questions as you can. So I hope you all enjoy the talk. Thank you and welcome, Alastair.
Good morning, and many thanks for inviting me to speak today, and thank you, Christina, for your kind introduction. At the outset, I must concede defence reviews have a rather dry reputation. The juicy highlights are public spats between the services in the national media, or more recently in the electronic environment, arising from leaks or the rhetoric of their most partisan supporters. 40 years ago, the 1981 Defence Review was a particularly feisty affair. The Cold War was decidedly chilly. Margaret Thatcher's embattled Conservative government confronted numerous challenges. Famously, the lady was not for turning, but many in the country, and some in her own party, preferred a less confrontational course. Before considering the origins, the process and the impact of the review on the RAF, I will examine the origins of Mrs. Thatcher's Cold Warrior reputation as the Iron Lady. Key dates in this were first, Mrs. Thatcher's election as Conservative Party leader in February 1975, the first female party leader, as we can see in this slide, from February 75. And the second key date is the Conservative victory in the May 1979 general election, when Mrs. Thatcher became Britain's first woman Prime Minister. So, to go on to talk about forging the Iron Lady, for over 4 years, from February 75 to the May of 1979, Mrs. Thatcher was leader of the opposition. On the 24th of February 1976, the Soviet Army newspaper Red Star bestowed the label Iron Lady on Mrs. Thatcher. It would stick, a badge she would wear with pride. But what had she done to deserve this? Well, it arose from a tub-thumping speech she had made 5 days earlier at Kensington Town Hall. The Labour Party's defence policy was in Mrs. Thatcher's sights. Reduced by the Defence Secretary Roy Mason in his 1974-75 Defence Review, defence faced ad hoc cuts over the next 2 years, denting Britain's credibility as an ally. Mrs. Thatcher stated, that government's first duty was to safeguard its people against external aggression, to guarantee the survival of the British way of life. Instead, she claimed the Labour government was dismantling defences, despite the most severe threat to Britain and its allies since 1945. She pondered, perhaps some people in the Labour Party think they are on the same side as the Russians. Any notion that the era of détente signalled Cold War thawing was dismissed by Mrs. Thatcher. In her eyes, the Soviets were bent on world dominance. The Iron Chancellor label, on the other hand, does not relate to the 19th century Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Rather, it refers to Mrs. Thatcher's role as First Lord of the Treasury. As Prime Minister, that is, as you can see that on the door of number 10, Mrs. Thatcher took the role of First Lord of the Treasury extremely seriously, frequently demanding tougher targets and deeper cuts than even Treasury ministers and officials. So let's get down to defending the realm. Fast forward to May 1979. Defence had not been a major general election issue. Employment and industrial relations dominated the 1979 campaign. However, in opposition, as we've seen, the Conservatives maintained they stood for strong defence, and in Ministry of Defence circles, there was optimism. Defence, meanwhile, was anchored to the four pillars undermining Roy Mason's 1975 Defence Review, which placed NATO and collective security front and centre. So here we see Roy Mason entering Downing Street and the four pillars of defence that were agreed in his 1975 Defence Review. These were, first, the nuclear deterrent; secondly, the defence of the UK; thirdly, the maritime commitment in the Eastern Atlantic and the Channel; and fourthly, the continental commitment encompassing the British Army of the Rhine and RAF Germany. The maritime and the continental pillars were the two most expensive. The Conservatives' defence inheritance was a mixed bag. So when Mrs. Thatcher arrives in Downing Street in May 1979, defence is decidedly a mixed bag. Labour had committed to NATO's 3% annual real increases to defence spending, in line with President Jimmy Carter's 1977 initiative, but initially only for 2 years from 1979-80. Labour had also started to restore service pay parity and placed significant naval orders. For the RAF, the multi-million pounds collaborative Tornado programme was absolutely central. And indeed, even after continued cuts, defence spending in 1978-79 still approached 5% of GDP, compared to us barely having a 2% defence spend currently. Conversely, no provision was made for Polaris nuclear deterrent replacement. Record numbers were also trying to leave the services. Continued cuts had hit morale. Service wages by 1978-79 had fallen in real and relative terms. Personnel had had to undertake civilian contingency roles during bitter industrial disputes, acting as firemen and air traffic controllers, for instance. Moreover, the MOD's own way ahead studies anticipated tough choices ahead, whoever was in government. Mrs. Thatcher's new Defence Secretary, a key player in this talk, was Francis Pym, a wartime Lancers officer and an ex-Conservative Chief Whip. Pym actually wanted to become Foreign Secretary, so defence was not his first choice of job. As we can see here from this quotation from Michael Heseltine, when Mrs. Thatcher was dishing out the cabinet portfolios in May 1979. The third key figure, after Thatcher and Pym, was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Geoffrey Howe. His role was particularly important. He was spearheading the new government's ambitious economic reforms, encompassing shrinking the state and championing private sector growth. And we should remember too that Mrs. Thatcher was the last Prime Minister of the wartime generation. Service experience flowed through her cabinet. Mrs Thatcher met the manifesto pledge to deliver service pay parity straight away. Pym also got the Prime Minister's endorsement to travel to Brussels and tell his new NATO counterparts of the new government's commitment to 3% real annual increases to the defence budget. Geoffrey Howe and the Treasury were frustrated. With difficult decisions being taken and tough spending targets all across government, they complained defence and law and order seemed exempt from deep spending cuts which were hitting other programmes. Pym put up a dogged resistance for defence. He pointed to the inadequate budget he inherited, and he pointed to the 3% pledge, despite continued Treasury efforts to finesse the figures and alter definitions. Pym insisted the government maintained credibility on defence. Allies, the services, and Conservative voters were all watching. The government, though, faced contradictory pressures. On one hand, cutting public spending and reducing the size of the state. On the other, increasing the defence budget. And indeed, the world was more dangerous, summed up by the American singer Billy Joel, who famously sang, "Ayatollahs in Iran, Russians in Afghanistan." That summed up 1979-80. However, Mrs Thatcher's head was turned against the MOD with a triple whammy of negative briefing in her Christmas 1979 recess box. Her three informants were Derek Rayner, the government's efficiency advisor and former Chief of Defence Procurement, Clive Whitmore, Mrs Thatcher's principal private secretary and a senior MOD official, and Captain John E. Moore, who was the editor of Jane's Fighting Ships and a friend of her parliamentary private secretary, Ian Gow. All three stressed MOD waste and efficiency. All highlighted a lack of resolve to secure savings. All said the MOD and its ministers could do better. That dreadful term, a perfect storm, faced defence in 1980. Crucially, the MOD exceeded annual Treasury cash limits. There were good reasons for MOD overspending. The Treasury had underestimated inflation, and firms whose other work was drying up in recession delivered and significantly billed early, leading to a run on the MOD's cash reserves. MOD ministers and senior officials complained about cash limits. Pym argued defence was already underfunded. But the gap would only get wider when Pym announced the government's preference for the US Trident system to replace Polaris. Moreover, the burden for Trident fell on the Navy budget. Defence could no longer be different as the economy shrank and dole queues lengthened. In 1980, GDP fell by 2.5%. Unemployment was heading to over 3 million. Trident and other talk of reviving intervention capability meant the defence budget would be hard-pressed. The focus was on the two big spending areas, maritime and continental commitments. Initially, Mrs Thatcher, Pym and the Foreign Secretary Lord Carrington were keener on continental cuts, although sensed that political realities precluded them. With the Treasury cash limit squeeze, the Prime Minister and Howe insisted on savings cuts, on spending cuts. The Iron Lady and Iron Chancellor guys demanded savings. Pym protested that Treasury-driven reductions meant NATO allies would doubt the government meant business on defence. Spending was rising at barely 1% annually in real terms. It fell behind Labour's plans, according to Pym. Nevertheless, Mrs Thatcher insisted on reshaping the programme to meet available resources. The MOD's Defence Programme Working Party formed in spring 1980 to investigate budgetary pressures. This marked the first time a small group in the central staffs of the MOD had assumed a leading role in reviewing defence plans. The Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Michael Betham wanted greater study of the relative threats. The committee's work reflected PIM's more consensual approach. Essentially, this mini review followed a policy of equal misery across the services, although the Navy claimed most pain. The toughest choice between a continental army and a deep water navy was avoided. The RAF's plans were considerably cut back. Planned UK air defence improvements were put on ice. Replacement aircraft were deferred. Others were taken out of service earlier than anticipated. Equipment orders were cut and infrastructure improvements were delayed. PIM blamed inflation, higher oil prices, accelerated deliveries and earlier billing for Defence's deteriorating situation. Mrs Thatcher cited a 16% pay increase for MOD's industrial civil servants and maintained the MOD was hopeless with contractors. Savings on day-to-day activities involved curtailing training and exercises, with reductions to RAF fuel allocations and flying hours. Then in August 1980, the MOD was forced to initiate a 3-month moratorium on new orders. PIM criticised this blunt instrument and false economy. He kept complaining about the Treasury's cash limit regime. The Treasury argued the defence budget could not simply grow unrelated to wider economic prospects. Geoffrey Howe, the Chancellor, thought defence was wasteful and overcommitted, exacerbated by Trident. When the crunch came, meeting cash limit targets and displaying economic competence to the markets trumped commitments to increase defence spending by 3% to impress NATO allies. However, with deep cross-government spending cuts in late 1980 and MOD savings a Treasury priority, PIM and the Chiefs of Staff still avoided the deepest reductions. Privately, Mrs Thatcher lamented the reductions. Nobody was more disappointed than she to cut defence, but in a deep recession, it was, in her words, absolutely unavoidable. As I've said, PIM battled hard for defence, but in the Prime Minister's eyes, he was not one of us. Indeed, as her government struggled on numerous fronts, PIM was even touted as a potential successor, able to unite the various wings of the Conservative Party. Nevertheless, his strident opposition to defence savings and criticism of spending mechanisms meant PIM's days at the MOD were numbered. The Chiefs of Staff and the most senior defence civil servant, Sir Frank Cooper, who we see here, the Chiefs and Sir Frank now viewed a defence review as inevitable. PIM would not lead it. In Mrs Thatcher's first cabinet reshuffle on the 5th of January 1981, PIM was replaced as Defence Secretary by the monetarist Trade and Industry Secretary, John Knott, who we can see here. Knott was 8,000 miles away in Indonesia when his appointment was announced. Mrs Thatcher, though, considered Knott had a real grasp of finance and commitment to efficiency, which defence needed. Mrs Thatcher discussed her ministerial changes on Judith Chalmers' afternoon ITV show, but unlike the famously well-travelled host, government was proving no holiday for this Prime Minister. Knott's remit was clear: to take a radical look at the defence programme and get it onto an affordable basis. He didn't like the term defence review, associating it with Labour's cuts of the 70s. However, Mrs Thatcher's type of foreign policy could not involve defence on a shoestring. Her friend Ronald Reagan's election to the presidency the previous November and the importance she played on the Anglo-American relationship took the deepest cuts off the menu, especially as the new American administration promised big defence spending increases. Knott met his top team for a talk-in at Greenwich in January 1981, where the challenges facing defence were discussed. Nott's appointment was met with trepidation in the MOD. In Treasury circles, his appointment was welcomed. He was viewed by Howe as a trustee. Media critics viewed him as the Treasury's man. Nott considered himself a realist. He was indeed his own man. He thought the defence budget was hopelessly overextended. Mrs. Thatcher agreed and was appalled at the overcommitment and escalating costs. Nott set exam questions for the Chiefs of Staff and the civilian hierarchy, asking Betham, or Chief of the Air Staff, for his views on reshaping RAF Germany to reduce costs and to concentrate the tornado force in Britain. The Chief of the General Staff, the head of the army, was asked about reshaping the British Army of the Rhine. In his so-called Bermudagram in March 1981, Nott set out lower projected spending levels for the services to construct their core programmes for the next decade. He stated the existing programme was in a mess. Preserving the 4 pillars of defence at existing levels was unaffordable. This was a review run by senior defence civil servants close to Nott. He had been frustrated at the service chief's attachment to the idea of equal misery. Trident, which we can see here, was off limits. The defence of the UK was a priority. The RAF was in a fairly strong position by virtue of NATO considerations and the continental commitment. Despite Nott's misgivings at tornado costs, which he stated frequently, in ideal circumstances, he would have preferred to give the RAF additional funding. Nott also appreciated, as we saw in an earlier slide, that Betham was a tough customer. In contrast, Nott was infuriated by the Navy's approach and lack of clarity. Surface fleet cuts were soon in his sights. He thought surface ships were costly and vulnerable to Soviet attack. He preferred nuclear submarines and maritime patrol aircraft. Nott's perspective was also formulated by official MOD advice, where thinking was weighed heavily against the naval staff. During this process, in the first half of 1981, the RAF's corner was fought well by Betham. He preferred to lobby business rather than the press, unlike the Navy. The RAF and the Army agreed Central Europe was the decisive arena for any NATO-Warsaw Pact confrontation. The Navy disagreed, demanding greater even-handedness for the Eastern Atlantic and Channel maritime commitment. The Navy stressed to Nott the catastrophic impact of cuts and fed their doomsday scenarios into the national press. Nott was unimpressed on both counts. It only hardened his resolve. Mrs. Thatcher then fired the Navy Minister, Keith Speed, for publicly questioning Navy cuts in a constituency speech. In essence, Nott and his senior officials wanted to get defence onto a sure footing to avoid the short-term cash squeezes which had blighted defence and the services in 1980. Resource stability was paramount for Nott. Recalling his experiences as a regular officer in the Gurkha Rifles in Malaya in the 1950s, Nott prioritised adequate ammunition, supplies and stocks over expensive equipment platforms. Nott also sought speed to rebuild the long-term programme in the face of resource constraints. He rejected lengthy consultation processes, which he thought would frustrate any tough decisions. Eventually, Nott made his Commons announcement on the 25th of June 1981 with a 14-page white paper, the United Kingdom Defence Programme, The Way Forward. The big loser was the Royal Navy and the Surface Fleet. About 60% of cuts fell on the Navy, of planned cuts fell on the Navy. Much of the remainder fell on the Army. Alongside fewer aircraft in the 1980s, particularly in the early 1980s, the RAF lost 2,500 personnel and Jaguar replacement was put on hold. Nevertheless, Nott's plans greatly disappointed the Treasury, with Geoffrey Howe, the Chancellor, pitching alternative proposals late in the day to the Cabinet, which were too politically painful for his ministerial colleagues to accept. Indeed, from this review, Nott secured 3% increases for a revised defence budget to 1985-86 in real terms. Defence spending would increase by 21% between 1978-79 and 1985-86. So Nott did achieve, a result, real significant spending increases. Mrs. Thatcher accepted Nott's prescription for defence, but he soon disappointed her, being part of the Cabinet majority which frustrated her plans to cut public spending by a further £5 billion in the summer of 1981. Nott was damaged politically before the Falklands and subject to Downing Street sniping. Defence reviews rarely mark the end of the process. The Treasury always likes to come back for some more. Within weeks of his announcement, the Treasury attempted to reopen Nott's review as defence costs overran again. Nott was said to have embraced the MOD's big spending culture. Defence seemed to be swallowing up cash again. The Navy secured some isolated post-review and pre-Falklands concessions. The amphibious assault ships, Fearless and Intrepid, were to stay in service, but the carrier Invincible was still to be sold to Australia. And here we see the Invincible, one of the three through-deck cruisers, as they were called, the others being Illustrious and Ark Royal, basically small aircraft carriers. So at this stage, before the Falklands, the Invincible was still to be sold to Australia. For the RAF, the phasing out was accelerated of the Vulcan bomber, the Canberra photographic reconnaissance aircraft, Shackleton airborne early warning aircraft, and Buccaneer maritime strike aircraft. Deliveries of the multi-role Tornado were also slowed down. Then the Falklands conflict from April 1982 was precisely the war that Britain and Nott's Review were planning for least, out of area and with the Royal Navy as the lead service. And here we see the four chiefs of staff during both Nott's Review in 81 and during the subsequent Falklands conflict from April 1982. We see them left to right: Betham, Chief of the Air Staff; Leach, Chief of the Naval Staff; Sir Terence Lewin, who's really the senior figure here as Chief of the Defence Staff; and Sir Edwin Bramall, Chief of the General Staff, Head of the Army, who eventually became the next Chief of the Defence Staff. So some naval cuts were then reversed post-Falklands, and the Invincible was not sold to Australia, but was indeed retained. So in conclusion, from late 1982, greater RAF resources were sent to the Falklands, the South Atlantic, to bolster Fortress Falklands. Nevertheless, Nott, fully supported by the RAF, successfully emphasised the continued priority of the continental commitment and NATO tasks. After the Falklands, they averted a dramatic shift towards a new maritime course, which was demanded by the senior service, the Navy, and a vociferous naval lobby in the press, buoyed up by the victory in the South Atlantic. Moscow remained the main threat, not Buenos Aires or any threat to the Falklands. The continental commitment, NATO, remained the main threat. Nevertheless, even before the mauling Nott received over the Falklands, he had decided to step down and return to business. His replacement in January 1983 was Michael Heseltine. That is another story. For Mrs. Thatcher, the The post-Falklands atmosphere and return to economic growth led to a landslide general election victory in June 1983 against divided opposition. She could credibly claim to be both Iron Lady and Iron Chancellor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alastair. That was really fascinating. A brilliant talk. Lovely, thank you. Everybody, we're open for questions now. So if you want to send a question through to Alastair, there's the Q&A function just at the bottom of your screen. Please do feel free to send any questions through and we'll work our way through them. To start us off, we've had a question from Neil, who has asked, how was the review shown to be either fortuitous or perhaps wanting in light of the Falklands War the following year? I know you've touched on this, but
yeah. I mean, the Falklands was precisely the war that Nott's review was not geared to meeting. I mean, it was, as we said, out of area, whereas Nott was pro the continental commitment. It involved surface ships again, very much involved surface ships. The task force heading to the South Atlantic in April 1982. This was again an area that Nott was preparing to cut. So it was, to a degree, it was fortuitous. Had the Argentinians waited another matter of months or another year, more of these ships would have been out of service. The Invincible would have probably been sold to the Australians, and the Navy would not have been able to mount the same scale of task force. So, yeah, I think it was lucky that they basically Buenos Aires struck too soon. Yeah,
lucky for us, less so for them. Lovely, thank you, Alastair. You mentioned that there were personnel cuts as part of the scaling back of spending, but also unemployment was quite a high percentage at the time. So how did they justify making even more people unemployed at that time, when obviously a lot of people were already out of work?
Yeah, that was the thing, because as I said in the talk there, in the late 70s, there was a tremendous outflow from the services, because there was this sort of depression at where the services stood in the sort of wider sort of employment, in wider world of employment, and you had quite an exodus from the service in the late 70s. And then Mrs. Thatcher comes in, you suddenly get this great pay cut, returning to sort of pay parity in 1979. And you get very, very limited. There's hardly anyone leaving the services. I mean, the retention is transformed. So you then have this adding an extra. What was ended up being about 19 or 20,000 to the dole queue, as you say, during a period of high unemployment. And I mean, these were certain areas suffered particularly. For instance, the closure of Chatham Dockyard, the massive scaling down at Portsmouth. There were heavy unemployment in areas where some areas were already unemployment black spots, and this made it even worse. But I mean, he's not saying that defence cannot run the way that it is. It needs to be changed, and he justifies putting defence on a sure financial footing as his main aim. And this includes, as I say, adding 20,000 more to an expanded dole queue. When he goes to visit places like Portsmouth and Chatham, he is greeted. He is greeted by very, very, very critical crowds who basically throw things at him. He has a very, very grim reception when he visits these places, because there's a great annoyance at the cutbacks.
I can completely understand, to be honest. It must have been very bad for morale. In
the parts of the services, yeah, and particularly in certain sections in sort of shipbuilding in the Navy, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So a question's come through from Tim. He says, I recall weaknesses in UK air defence receiving much publicity in the late 1970s. What long-term effect did the 1981 review have on this aspect of defence?
Yeah, they had planned. The Conservatives were when they got into office, they said that Labour had run down Britain's air defences. This was a major issue in many debates prior to the 1979 general election. And the Conservatives make the point under Pym and his Minister for the RAF, Geoffrey Patty. They try to enhance and increase the UK air defence. They try to bring back some Lightning squadrons. They try to arm the Hawk training aircraft. They try to improve and run on Phantom aircraft as well, to sort of bring numbers up to, you're talking roughly anywhere between around about between 70 and 80 and in the just over 100 sort of aircraft to defend the UK. And they're trying to up this figure by any means. I mean, what the chief of the air staff, what Betham wants to see is more of the air defence variant of the Tornado, whereas what the government offers is mainly sort of short-term. Old Lightnings being put back, as I said, running on the Phantoms and arming the Hawk trainers. So there's a lot. They do actually manage to up numbers during the course of the 1980s with the air defence variant of the Tornado coming in and the Phantoms being run on. But it certainly takes them longer than they'd wanted to do this.
Mm. Do you feel that allocation between the services as well was the right course? So kind of funding more to the RAF ultimately and taking it away from the Navy. Do you think that was the right course of action to take?
That was the Navy were, of course, the Navy were further angered because not only are they're going to get less in the sort of projections of Knott's Review as a percentage of the defence budget, but they were also going to have to pay up for Trident. It was going to come off their budget, whereas previously Trident had been, Trident's predecessor Polaris had been funded out of sort of central government. So they were going to get less and also have the burden of Trident. Mm-hmm. And the RAF, it looked very, very good. I mean, it did look like it was going to increase right the way through to the 1990s under the projections that Knott had put in his review. Ultimately, though, it doesn't really happen that way, unfortunately, during the course of the 80s.
Thank you, Alastair. I've got a question here from Colin, who has asked, to what extent did previous military service prove an advantage or not for an S of S from both government and single service perspectives? The experience, yeah, I think it did. I think there's much more knowledge on defence issues in the Thatcher government at the outset than there is nowadays. There's not the same experience. Of course, there's still this Second World War generation, and I mean, even Pym's predecessor, the last Labour Defence Secretary under the Callaghan government, Fred Mully, had been a POW in France for 5 years. Pym had served. Carrington, the Foreign Secretary, had served. And of course, Knott had served in Malaya. So they've got a more knowledge of sort of defence on the ground and experience of sort of military life, and been able to perhaps also better able to deal with the military hierarchy and the chiefs, because they themselves have got service experience. They could relate to them probably better than, say, subsequent defence secretaries. Say someone like maybe Malcolm Rifkind in the 1990s. He was very much sort of Edinburgh lawyer, and very different background, whereas people like Pym and Carrington and Knott and even Heseltine have got some military and defence experience. Yeah, I can certainly understand that would be a great advantage, actually.
Yeah.
I've had an anonymous question come through, which has asked, how did the public overall then perceive the review? So you mentioned obviously there was a negative reaction from the people who had been in the forces who had lost their jobs, but in general, how much were the public actually aware of the changes, and how did they perceive the review?
I think other than the particular depots, sites, and stations that were earmarked for closure, I think much of the sort of perception of the review was driven by the press, and the press were very pro-Navy. the Navy had continually leaked to the press throughout the process, and continued to leak after Nott's announcement in June 81, and right through before and after the Falklands, pushing for the naval cuts to be reversed. So a lot of this public views is pushed by the sort of Navy lobby in the press, and it's really significant. I mean, you have editorials day after day in the aftermath of the Falklands Islands saying, stop giving the RAF and the army so much money so they can sit about in Germany. This money needs to go to surface ships. This needs to go to submarines. It needs to go to the Royal Navy. The Navy has proven itself, and really did very well to sort of withstand this and say, no, the main threat remains the continent. The main threat remains Moscow. The continental commitment remains paramount. So it was certainly the press. The press is very negative. Nott himself doesn't come over particularly well. He walks out in various TV interviews. He's tetchy and twitchy. He's not really very good as a TV performer. And of course, you have the business, and certainly there's the press, and there's the local pressures in places like I said in Kent and in Portsmouth, where you do see these closures, and there's very much like this is we voted Conservative, we voted for stronger defence, and look, they're shutting the dockyards, they're shutting the naval base, and yeah, so there's a lot of criticism. I don't think really Nott's review was at all popular, nor really did it just about got by Conservative MPs.
Right. I mean, thinking about the press as well, they often can exert a lot of pressure. So
they did back then. It was editorial day after day in the Times, talking about the Navy being the main service, and having to look forward to the Navy rather than spending on the RAF and the Army, particularly in Germany.
They're up against some very tough politicians there who weren't going to give way.
No, Nott didn't, and the RAF was very clever in the fact that various chiefs of the air staff, including Betham and his predecessors, would write to the media and were making speeches and saying, no, excellent what happened in the South Atlantic, wonderful, but the focus must still be on the continent and the Soviet threat.
And do you feel that was a big threat at the time? Do you think that was the area to concentrate on?
Yeah, it seemed that, yes, yeah. I mean, that was the major threat. You still in the Soviet Union, you've still got Brezhnev, and then you have Andropov, the head of the KGB, coming in, and it is a very tense and cold time. As I said, it's post-Afghanistan. We've seen what's happened in Iran as well. The Middle East is the Iran-Iraq war. It's a dangerous world, and the Russians are seen by many senior figures in the British military to actually be, during the course of the 80s, they were seen as potentially becoming stronger than the Americans. Although that, of course, was, as we found out, very misplaced.
Yes. Thank you, Alastair. I've got another couple of questions that have just come in. So we'll start first with James. So she said, it's very easy to be wise in hindsight. Moving the clock forward, do you think that the decision to purchase the Tornado was a flawed decision because it was proved to be unsuitable in the first Gulf War?
Yeah. I mean, that's ironic that the Tornado is there for the two variants are either there for the continent or for the air defence of the UK, and then it ends up NATO. The conflict does not happen in Central Europe. It happens, as you say, in the Gulf, where I think in the first Gulf War we lost six tornadoes. I think it was 6 tornadoes were lost, and I mean it's proven to be such a long-lived aircraft, and it was still serving up until about I think it was taken out of service 2019, the final tornadoes. So really, it's proven to be a very, I mean, it was central to the RAF. So I think it really served more widely than the Gulf War as well. It served in you had tornadoes serving in various other conflicts and peacekeeping roles and over the former Yugoslavia. So and subsequently in Afghanistan and in various things in Libya, the Libya business in 2011. So really, it served widely, and it served well, and it served for a heck of a long time.
I think a lot of aircraft, they have kind of their strengths and weaknesses, don't they? So even if they're in use for a long time, maybe in certain campaigns or certain situations they really excel at, even if in other areas they have perhaps struggled a bit more. But yeah, as you say, it's been in service a long time, and there must be a reason for that.
I take the point that there were issues. There were certainly issues, and there were difficulties and challenges in 1991. Most definitely.
Thank you, Alastair. I've got another question for you here from Pierce, which says, had the Falklands conflict not occurred, how do you think Nott's review and vision would have possibly impacted on the MOD's ability to take part in the First Gulf War in 1990?
I think we may have been better equipped, because the RAF and the Army certainly the RAF certainly does lose out to a degree during the course of the 1980s. These forecast spending increases that Nott's white paper in June 1981 had planned, they don't really come to fruition. And at the same time, you have increased spending, for instance, on the Navy, both to recover the ground lost in the Falklands and the lost ships, but also there are, for instance, the three small aircraft carriers are retained. The Hermes is retained up until about 1985. So the RAF is, as a result of the Falklands, certainly loses some of these projected increases, and there is a shift towards the Navy. The other thing is that after 1985-86, defence spending actually in real terms starts to decline, having increased by about 21% in the first 7 years of the Thatcher government. It then starts to fall. So really, there's a lot of warnings as well in the run-up to the Gulf War that really there's an awful lot of problems with, for instance, support and supplies, and that is of course seen when they try to assemble forces for the Gulf War. There's that sort of writing is on the wall 2 or 3 years before the Gulf War actually kicks off in 1991, that all is not well, and that things have been cut back by too great a degree, for instance, in Germany. And that's the problem. There's not really that the planned spend increases just don't really actually happen in the late 80s. And in fact, it's real time the reductions.
I see. Is that part of, because you mentioned in the talk that in addition to, say, personnel that were affected, it impacted infrastructure as well. So do you think it was that was the impact that kind of had an ongoing?
Yeah, there's definitely reductions to support. And then when, like I say, when spending does not increase after 1986, corners are cut and savings are found, and really it's quite clear that defence is struggling, and there's real issues with defence. And indeed, it gets by 1990, at the time of the next defence review, which actually happens during the Gulf War. We have options for change in Paul King in 1990, and then a few days later, Saddam invades Kuwait. You see further cuts there, including quite sharp cuts to the RAF, mainly because they see, well, the world's changing, and we've got this sort of new world order. We've got the demise of the Soviet Union on the cards, and then a few days later we have Saddam's invasion.
Gosh, there's one thing ends and something else starts, isn't it?
Yes.
And you mentioned as well, you've obviously talked quite a lot about the RAF and the conflict with the Navy. How did the Army fit into that? I mean, they will have seen some losses as well, but was there a big conflict between them? And any kind of rivalry between the Army and the RAF, the way that there has been with the Navy and the RAF?
Well, the Army and the RAF are both pushing towards this continental commitment for the British Army of the Rhine and RAF Germany. So they're both keener on the continental commitment, and you see the real tension is between Betham as chief of the air staff and Leach, who was the chief of the naval staff, who they think is going to resign during the course of the Knots review, and he doesn't, and then he becomes central to the Falklands by saying, yes, we can send a task force. So the tensions really are mainly between the Navy and the RAF. The Army is once the sort of commitment to Central Europe is seen again as paramount. The Army is basically less under threat, but the tensions, and Knott says this later on, were between Betham and Leach, and it was I think it was really quite unpleasant. Yeah.
Thank you, Alastair. Just had a comment rather than a question come through from Neil on the Q&A. Just referring back to the tornadoes. So Neil said tornadoes undertook the almost suicidal denouement of the JPP 233 runway denial pod, and this is where nearly all the losses took place. So any other aircraft would have suffered the same, if not greater losses.
Yeah, in 1990, yeah.
Lovely. I think we have only really time for one or two more questions. If anybody's got anything else to ask Alastair before we close. Just to give you a moment in case anybody does have a last question. Alastair, I just wondered if you would like to just tell everyone a little bit about your work at the AHB, actually, and how you got into the subject, and how you came to research it.
Well, Air Historical Branch has been on the go since 1918. We were closed for a short spell between, I think, 1936 and 1941. So the branch, I think, is the oldest of the three service historical branches. And I joined the branch in 2015, by which time we were already at RAF Northolt. We were previously at Bentley Priory until about 2009. So the branch moved to Northolt in 2009, and I've been there, like I say, for the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, it's a fascinating job being a historian with the branch. I mean, the branch is providing historical support and advice to the air staff and to the RAF and to wider government on all matters really relating to the history of the RAF. So we are involved in archival matters, we're involved in research, and we're really involved in support to both the air staff and to the wider community. I mean, we can be contacted. We do have an email address, which is ahb.raf@btconnect.com. So that's our email address, and we do have various materials on our website, and we're currently working on doing more on that. And we also can see the material that we've produced in the past. The narrative histories can be found in the Air 41 class at the National Archives at Kew. So we've been around for a while, and certainly, particularly in the post-Second World War era, there's a huge amount produced.
Yes, so certainly you've been of great help to us at the museum. So I highly recommend anyone to enlist their help, because they're absolutely brilliant, I have to say.
Right.
A question from Mark Parry has just come through. He's asked, can you recommend any further reading around this topic? Any books or articles or anything that anyone can go to? Well,
the best book maybe would perhaps be the biography of Michael Betham, which covers both the sort of political side of things and the intrigues and the squabbles, but of course also covers Betham's fascinating life as a pilot, as a senior figure in the RAF, head of RAF Germany, Commander-in-Chief RAF Germany, then Chief of the Air Staff for the longest spell other than Lord Trenchard. And the book is Stay the Distance by Peter Jacobs, which is the biography of Betham. That would be a good starting point. And it's a good read and it's beautifully illustrated. So it's a fascinating read about a fascinating man.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alastair. And just a comment from one of our audience, Pierce. A comment for you, actually, Alastair, just to say your team gave great support when he was closing all the infrastructure at RAF Lynham, helping to rehouse some of their important historical items. So thank you.
Thanks.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, Alastair. I'm afraid we are out of time for more questions now. So I would like to say a huge thank you to you for today's wonderful talk and for your time this morning. So we hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you stay safe, keep well, and have a lovely weekend. Thank you. And thank you again, Alastair.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye for now.